On today's episode of Crooked Mustache, we're going to be replacing one of the diesel fuel injectors on this 6-liter Powerstroke Ford. Stay tuned. All right, hold on, wait a second, wait. Before you skip through the video, I'm going to tell you exactly where you need to go. If you are already elbow deep into this project under the hood of your truck, skip to this timestamp, and that's where we actually start working on taking the valve cover off. Everyone else, if you're not already halfway through this project under the hood of your truck, give me a second. I'm going to explain every step along the way, give you guys a heads up of exactly what you're getting yourself into, and tell you all the tools you're going to need to try and avoid some of the hurdles that we ran into. Back to the video. There are a few basic parts you're going to need as preventative maintenance if this is the first time you're doing this job on, in the case of this thing, 300,000 miles. So if you're going to be doing this job, there's a few additional parts you're going to need. Number one, obviously, you're going to need the fuel injector itself if you're replacing a bad injector. That's number one. Number two, what you're going to need is the standpipe. Each bank of the engine uses one standpipe, and that's what holds the actual oil injection or fuel injection assembly in place. So you're going to need one of those because you're going to need the new seals on it depending on how badly damaged the seals on your old one are. At this point, for this truck, it's at 300,000 miles. There was no way we were putting the old one back, so we've got a new standpipe. In addition to that, you're going to need the dummy pipe, which goes on the opposite end. So those are the bare minimum parts you're going to need in order to get this job done. I'm going to set up the time lapse. We're going to remove everything from the passenger side that we need to get access to the valve cover itself so that we can remove injector number one. Now, if you're working on injector number 3, 5, or 7, it is going to be a little bit more difficult because the injectors are further back, but the process is the same. Simply is going to be that it's a little bit more difficult to get to those in the back because of the way that you're pulling out the oil injection manifold. I guess we can call it manifold at this point. So what we're going to do now is tear straight into this. We're going to go step by step, and I'm going to cover and tell you guys the tools you're going to need as we go along the way, and any things you might run into, at least on the passenger side of this vehicle. Let's go. All right, so I'm going to cover the tools that we're going to need, but before we move forward, it is worth mentioning that this is considered an advanced job. It goes without saying this is for entertainment purposes only. After all, doing this job could save you hundreds of dollars in labor charges, but keep in mind that I'm an experienced mechanic and I take no responsibility for your vehicle. Perform this repair at your own risk and your own volition. If this was a job that was going to be performed in a diesel shop, they would actually go ahead and lift the cab off the frame just to make getting access to the injectors that much easier. So keep that in mind as we're taking the battery, vacuum reservoir, intake tube, and glow plug computer off, that you are getting into a job which is on the advanced level. That said, here are the tools you're going to need: 5.5mm, 8mm, 10mm, and 12mm sockets. A 12mm deep socket for the valve cover bolts. You're going to need a 12mm wrench, preferably ratcheting, and you'll see why in the future. You're also going to need a T30 Torx socket for the oil rail bolts, as well as a T30 Torx bit for the hard-to-reach ones, and a 6.5mm or 1/4-inch wrench for the Torx bit. You'll see why later on. You're going to need a T40 extended shank Torx socket for the fuel injector, 12mm Allen socket for the standpipe and dummy plug, which may differ in size. You're going to need a pair of flathead screwdrivers, pliers or vice grip pliers, needle nose are preferred, a ratchet and accompanying extensions, either 1/2 inch, 3/8, or 1/4 inch drive. And finally, a torque wrench to make sure that everything that requires a specific torque is torqued to spec for its job. So, quick update of exactly where we stand. By now, we've got this connector, which I will probably put here on the screen, exactly what that is. That's disconnected. We have removed the computer and the carrying plate that holds that little computer onto this side of the engine bay. Disconnect this power lead so that this gives you more ability to move this harness because you are going to need it. We're going to go after all of the 12mm bolts that hold the valve cover down to remove the valve cover. Once the valve cover is down, we can go into the nitty gritty of the manifold, and that'll be on the next step. All right, so now while he's working on that, I'm going to do a better job explaining exactly what you're going to run into than I would have done under the hood of the truck. We're actually taking off the valve cover. It's all 12mm bolts, but it's pressed pretty much right up against the AC conditioning, the air conditioning system. And unless you want to remove it, which you may not want to if it's functioning just fine, or try forcing it out of the way, which might damage it, there is another solution, and I'm going to tell you guys that right now. So what we've got here is a picture of the passenger side valve cover. I'm going to tell you how to access all the bolts that are on it because some are going to be a little bit harder to get to than others. Alrighty, so looking at the valve cover, this over here, this is the front of the engine. So getting to these bolts right here is going to be cake. With a few extensions and a 12mm socket, you're going to have zero issue getting to the ones marked in blue. This one down here in yellow, under where the spout is for the actual oil fill, that one's a little bit more difficult. You are going to need an elbow to get to that one, but it is still achievable. It's not going to be impossible. The ones that are here in red, this one especially, which is closest to the firewall, and then these two down here are actually tucked behind the air conditioning system, and they are pretty much impossible to get to from under the hood, or unless you have the facilities to lift the cab off of your truck like you would at a diesel shop, it's going to be very difficult for us to do it ourselves. So for those bolts, I'm actually going to show you guys now in the video. We're going to remove the passenger side inner fender well, and that's going to give us access to get to those three bolts. With a 12mm, I would recommend a 12mm ratcheting wrench. It'll make your life a lot easier. You can pick up a set at Harbor Freight, pick up a set on Amazon. I'll leave some links in the video description. It's going to make life so much more easy to get that valve cover off. And also, with the fender liner off, you're going to notice in the future, we're actually going to use that position to access some of the bolts on the oil manifold. But for now, we're focusing on the valve cover. Let's take a look at what he's up to. There you go. He's actually working on the back, so I'll leave you to it. I'm removing this plate bracket off of the airbox to give my hand a little bit more access to the back. You're going to need a 5.5mm socket. Okay, what you're going to want to do is remove all of the surrounding hardware that holds the inner fender on, as well as this one, which I believe is an 8mm. Oh, there's one more up there. Didn't notice that one. There's also one more bolt, and it's actually right under that part of the fender liner, and it's the same as the silver ones, the 8mm. And then you've got, I'm going to flip the camera here, you've got two clips. With the inner fender removed, you will have much easier access, but you'll have much easier access to the lower valve cover bolts. And honestly, this is a much easier alternative than trying to force aside and possibly damage your air conditioning matrix, the motor, anything there. So that's what we're going to do to get to those last three bolts. And then once we get to those last three bolts, we can pull the valve cover off. We should be able to take, switch to the 0.6, should be able to take this whole piece out. I just got to figure out how.
One eternity later.
That's right, he can be taught.
So I've got light so you guys can see what I'm going for. So I'm gonna go at these kind of by braille, and I'm gonna have to circle them on the camera so that you can actually see them. And those are the ones holding the valve cover gasket on. There's the one in the back. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 that I have left to get to. You're also going to have to remove the transmission dipstick. If you do it carefully, it will not come out of its placement tube at the bottom where it meets the trans. And that will give you access from the top to this bolt, meaning that there's only 3 you have to get to from the bottom instead of 4. All right, and with that, all the bolts have been removed. Now, with the harness moved aside, now is the step that I've been slightly dreading, because we're gonna have to pull this thing out of here. We're not catching on anything other than the confinement of the actual valve cover itself. Pour the hoses, and we have got the valve cover clear. Now the next step is going to be removing the retaining bolts, which are Torx. Those look like they're going to be harder to get to. Now, before we take off the oil rail, we have to take out the dummy plug and at least loosen the oil standpipe. This is the thing that supplies oil to the oil rail itself. Now, in some cases, I've seen that it's used Torx bits for this, but in my case, all of my fittings were 12mm Allens, so that is what I opted to go to. The only downside being that I didn't have a 12mm Allen socket of any kind, so I had to get creative. So the time came to channel my wheeler dealer heroes, Ed China and Ant Anstead, and I had to make my own tool so I could get this job done. And a lot of grinding, and 2 recharges later, that poor old grinder really went through its paces. We have a little 12mm Allen extension, which I can put one end into a 12mm socket, and that gives me a 12mm Allen socket. So I was able to use that to actually engage and remove the dummy plug and engage and loosen the standpipe. I say loosen because it is a little bit of a mission to get the standpipe out, and we'll cover that in the next step. Alright, now he's going to run into the same snag that you guys are probably going to run into, and I'm going to try and save you the hours and hours of agony that I went through. So what we're working on is this thing called the standpipe. Now when you're removing this from the manifold, this is the part that is threaded in, and that's where you're going to need the Allen key. Now when this comes out, it's going to want to come out as a whole unit. When you go to take it out, this will not come out, short of tilting the engine over, which I did not figure out a way to how to do. This is not going to come out of the actual hole in the manifold. And to give you an idea of where we're talking, this part is going to be located here. All right, so that's where this is going to be located. Now, the thing you need to focus on is that these are 2 pieces. Apparently, depending on the model year of your truck, this can be 1 piece. If it's 1 piece, it's going to be much more difficult. But from what I'm seeing, all the trucks that I can find seem to be running this 2-piece design. So this is what you're going to need to do. In order to do this, in order to get this thing out, you're going to need either vice grips, needle nose pliers. Preferably, you would want needle nose pliers that are vice grips because they're much thinner. You're not going to have a lot of room to take this out. When this comes out of the airbox, you're going to be around there. This is how much you're going to be able to get there. And if you can see what I mean by the vice grips are tall enough that they might actually grab onto the thing, which is what you don't want to do. So to show you how you would do it, when you guys pull this out of the hole of the oil rail manifold, you're going to grab onto the top with your vice grips, and with your other hand, while you're holding onto this tube because you don't want this to drop down, you are going to start wiggling this back and forth, and I want to do it here so you guys can see that it will come free and it will pop out. Make sure you don't let this go because you're going to want to remove this, and then you're going to take this out. And then once both pieces are out, you can actually move on to the oil rail manifold. Now, before we move on to the oil rail manifold, I will point out that in the process of reinstalling everything, I actually did, once the oil rail manifold was back on, put it here on screen, once this was back on the car, on the truck, sorry, I actually did insert the tube itself into the hole, let it drop down, and then put the actual top half down. Now this does get torqued at the end of the job. I'll put the torque number down here. This, when you're actually tightening it down, you do torque this. It's not insane, but you do torque it down. There is a torque specification, and that is to make sure that this seats into itself and that the seals at the bottom and here at the top seat properly so that you can have good oil pressure throughout the entire system. Let's just check on, see where he's at. Okay, he's still there. So I wanted to go ahead and point out now actually getting the oil rail manifold off so that you guys have some idea of what you're going to be dealing with. Just as I mentioned before when we did the valve cover, there are going to be bolts that you're going to run into that are going to give you trouble. And lo and behold, it's the same 3 as before. Now I'm going to circle here in blue the ones that should give you no issue at all, which is going to be this one, this one, this one, the one up here, the one over here. Sorry, I missed that one in the middle. Those should give you 0 issue. You'll be able to reach them even with a Torx bit on an adapter on a 1/4 inch socket. Now for the remaining 3, which I'm marking here in red, mark all the hard to get ones in red, those you're going to have to get probably from where I had mentioned before, underneath through the wheel well where we talked about getting to the valve cover bolts. And for that, I actually ended up using a 1/4 inch wrench and the appropriate Torx bit, which is a T30. So with that, it was literally finding a way to wedge a Torx bit into the wrench so that it wouldn't constantly fall out, and then quarter turn at a time if you had to make sure that you can get those bolts out. And it is a tedious process, but remember, you are trying to do this job yourself. You're trying to save yourself some money, and not only that, you're trying to avoid disassembling your entire air conditioning. And if you have the facilities at home to lift the cab off of your truck, more power to you, buddy, but some of us don't. So this is the headache that some of us are going to have to go through, but it is a job that you can do in the driveway of your house. So let's head back to see what he's up to, and he's still trying to figure out how to get to it. So I'll leave you to it. There we go. So I'm just using a long drill extension with the Torx bit at the end to pull the bolts out. Unfortunately, the magnet is not strong enough. I'm having to reach in after the fact and pull the bolts out. They're all the same length. So that leaves me the one that's right there. And then the two, I believe I have to try and get to from the bottom. You can just see one there. And then the other one, which is a little bit further back. All right, now onto the standpipe. Now, as I mentioned, you are going to need pliers, vice grips, something to grab the lower portion of the actual standpipe itself. And I wanted you guys to see that I'm in the trenches with you. This is exactly how I did it. I'm not some diesel tech at a garage who lifted the cab off of the frame and had complete access to everything. This is exactly the way 90% of you are going to do it, because you guys are doing it in your driveway just like I did. It did take some finagling, but once we got the top part off, and make sure you don't drop the bottom one, while we had the oil rail already loosened, since we did the bolts for the oil rail first, we were able to start lifting the entire assembly up. Now, you want to make sure when you go to take the oil rail manifold off, you want to lift it straight out in the direction of all of the ports on the bottom to minimize any damage to the seals on the tops of the injectors. Now, one thing to keep in mind, something I didn't realize, that piece is a lot heavier than it seems.
Which is much heavier than it looks. Right. Oh, very heavy. Very, very heavy. What I did was that manifold, we lifted it as we pulled up the second half of the standpipe, and that allowed us to move the manifold out, replacing cylinder number 1. Now the time has come. Hey Siri, pause. Okay, so now we're getting ready to take the injector out. Now what we need to do is disconnect the injector harness, which goes to the engine, from here. Now this clip I thought was a pull. I thought you pull this clip out, this clip goes in, and then you push it in like a release and simply pull up. I'm trying to do this one-handed. There you go. Push this in. Okay, you push this in, and that will release this clip from the injector harness down there. All right, now the screwdriver method, you have to be very careful, but what you're gonna do is, in my case, it's gonna be top and bottom, and you're going to use that to release the clips and push the piece out. There we go. So there you guys can see the connectors out. There's the other 3 still in place. And we're able to do that without damaging the connector. Now we're going to pull this out, which is a Torx bolt right there. And we're going to try and use the Torx bit on one of these extensions rather than a Torx socket, so that we can keep this as thin as possible. There we go. Okay, let's pull the injector out. We wanted to not lose that collar, but there you go. Whoa, getting all over all my tools. You can see this thing is kind of spent, but I do see that the screen is clear. Looks like this thing may have just failed from wear and tear. And make sure that we pulled out the copper O-ring, which we did. All right, and before we put the new one in, we need to oil that baby up. Got the new one, got its protective casing off. All right, we've got the little nipple that covers the injector. That is looking much, much cleaner than the old one. I'm gonna pull out the injector plug at the top. Don't want to cause any issues there. And we're gonna grab some oil. It's in here, it's free. I'm gonna put it up here. Make sure that all of our orifices properly lubricated. We don't want to cut any of these O-rings as they go in. And this is our hold down. Our copper washer is in place. Slightly off to the side. I'm gonna have to torque it from out here anyways. Oh, it would appear that these things do have a specific orientation they like. This little clip, this little edge, goes toward the back, and you want the square side forward. And there we go. There we go. Alrighty.
Now, while I may have used a hex adapter and Torx bit for the installation of the injector, to torque it, I'm using one of these extended shank 1/4 inch Torx bits with a 3/8 adapter hooked up to a torque wrench. So we can get it installed to its correct specification, make sure that copper washer is crushed, and this injector will be set. Alright, now I'm going to cover a lot of the final steps kind of in this one time lapse as we're putting everything back together. So what I'm working on now is the standpipe. We're going to lube up all of the seals. There are seals on the top half that will get inserted into the bottom half. We're going to go ahead and drop the bottom half into its hole that we showed you guys on the cylinder head earlier. And we're going to slide the oil rail manifold over the top of that. You want to take a little bit of oil, make sure you put it on the oil injection ports, and as well as the top of the injectors themselves. The next thing you're going to torque down is the little bolts that hold down the oil rail manifold. I found some discrepancies on that information, but it is 8 to 10 foot-pounds. We opted to go with the 10 foot-pounds. That's for all of the little bolts that you're going to see me putting in now with the Torx bit. We're working them down there with the finger ratchet. The next thing we're going to be doing after we get all of those in is we're going to do the dummy plug and standpipe. Those are going to get torqued down. Again, I found more information that was a little bit conflicting, between 33 foot-pounds and 60 foot-pounds depending on the year. Once you finish with that, all that's left is to put the valve cover back on. You're going to begin reassembling everything, reinstall your air intake, all of your vacuum lines, your little vacuum booster and the battery, and then we're going to move on to the bleeding procedure. Now it's time for the dreaded bleed procedure. To begin bleeding your truck, what you're going to do is you're going to turn the motor over using the starter signal wire. We're going to turn it over for 10 seconds at a time, minimum 5 times, 30 to 40 second break in between to allow the starter to cool. Next, we're going to prime the fuel pumps. Using the key in the on position, we're going to do this 3 times to allow the system to cycle. On the first cycle, you're going to hear the vacuum pump prime the vacuum reservoir since we disconnected that. On every cycle, you're going to hear the injectors cycle through all of their clicking, and the fuel pump is going to prime and fill the bowls. Now you can go ahead and attempt to start the vehicle. When it does start, do not rev the engine. Allow it to idle on its own as it continues to bleed air from the fuel system into the tank. Finally, take it for a test drive to ensure the engine is operating smoothly. It's alive! It's alive! Well, there you go, guys. A step-by-step instruction video on how to replace the injector on a 6-liter Powerstroke Ford without removing the cab and without having complete access to the engine. So I hope that this is helpful to at least a few of you. I know the peanut gallery is going to go nuts saying that there's tons of other ways to do it, but hey, you know what? I don't have a 2-post lift in my garage, and I don't have the facilities to lift the cab off of a truck either, like most of you who are probably going to end up doing this job yourself. So hopefully I was able to help you guys. There's going to be links in the description down below for any tools that you may need. If you want to grab tools locally, I actually got my torque wrench from Home Depot and my Torx bits the actual Torx T30 whole set from Harbor Freight. Those are available locally. If you want to help support the channel, I have links down below that you guys can pick up a tool from there. Help support the channel, helps us out. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. It helps us with the algorithm. Subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming future videos. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching. For Crooked Mustache, I'm Alfred, and we'll see you next time. Dale!